Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. I'm Patty Roberts at St. Mary's University School of Law. Today's guest is Rachel Harmon. She is the Harrison Robertson Professor of Law at the University of Virginia Law School, where she also directs the Center for Criminal Justice. Welcome, Professor Harmon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you because you have carved out an area of the law that is relatively new, and we'll be talking, among other things, about your book with Aspen, The Law of the Police, second edition. It's kind of surprising to me it's already a second edition because your first edition was in 2021, and I know it was the first to survey how law governs police encounters. So maybe we can start with that. Please tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write the book, The Law of the Police, in 2021, and what prompts a second edition already?
Well, I wrote this book out of materials that I've been teaching for now nearly 20 years. I started teaching classes in policing law because my research is about policing and the law, and I think a lot about policing. And what I found in the legal academy is that students in law school are taking classes in criminal procedure and thinking that they had learned policing law. And it was surprising to me that both professors and students treated constitutional criminal procedure courses about the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment as if it were the whole law of the police. And so I started teaching a course focused on law and policing from the point of view of policing as a project and the law that regulates that project, as opposed to starting with the Fourth Amendment and asking, what are the implications for what police are allowed to do on the street? And the misleading way that policing, it's not that criminal procedure is bad. I love teaching criminal procedure. It might be my favorite class to teach. It's a very court-focused and constitution-focused project. And it starts with the moment in the classroom when you're introducing evidence, in the courtroom when you're introducing evidence, and works backwards from that. That's very different from what I'm interested in here, which is taking a police officer in the street and asking what law governs the kinds of encounters he has with people he deals with. That was the impetus for this book, was to maybe as a corrective and also to take advantage of new thinking and research about policing, which has happened over the last 10 years. I wrote a series of articles basically arguing that constitutional criminal procedure is too narrow a window into policing, and that we should be thinking differently about policing and the law. And people have been doing that. And so there's been much more thinking by scholars and also, I think, practitioners about the ways that law and policing interact.
So because I'm not an expert in this field, I'd love to know, and I bet there are listeners who would like to know, what law does govern the police? I mean, I think those of us who are in law school so often think, or have been to law school so often think, oh, governmental immunity, like hardly anything is going to impact the police, but you've written the whole text about it and many articles about it. So what law does govern? And I think we're talking about local police here.
Yeah, so the book is mostly about local police officers, although the law that I talk about applies to lots of other kinds of policing as well. In terms of what law governs the police, I think that it's very helpful to remember first that what police officers are. That is, police officers, no, you can't put out a shingle that says, I'm a police officer, and then open up your private practice. Police officers are people who are empowered by the state to use certain kinds of authority in the name of the state, and mostly that authority is about stopping people, searching people, and arresting people. Not to say that that's all that police officers do, but that's the core of their coercive authority. And those people are only empowered, if you're talking about local police officers, by state law. So a police officer has to be licensed by the state, he is empowered by the state, and then he gets to do the things we associate with policing. And a lot of the things that we associate with policing they grow out of these very relatively narrow powers to stop or to search or to arrest people. But then there's lots of other law that influences what those police officers do with those powers. So there's state law that says how they have to be trained. There are constitutional laws, including the Fourth Amendment, which regulates search and seizures, the Fifth Amendment that regulates interrogations, or The First Amendment, which regulates what you can constrain people from saying. Those are all constitutional laws. There are many others that influence what police officers do. So I think understanding that police officers are created by localities, they are hired by, funded by these local cities. They're empowered by the state, which gives them their authority. They're constrained by the state and by federal law, even international law, and that's how they go about their business. Now, one of the things about local policing is that it's also shaped a lot by, not surprisingly, not so much local law, but local police departments. Because I said police officer can't put out a shingle and call themselves a police officer. Not only do they have to be licensed by a state, but all policing happens within the context of departments. There are no solo police officers. And that's actually probably the most important thing we know about policing, because it all takes place in these departments, and we can influence those departments, which influences what police officers do.
Do you find, as you're doing your research into local police departments, that there are vast differences between neighboring localities? I would think that might be a complexity to all of this law of policing.
Yeah, I think in some ways, police departments across the country look quite similar. They're all hierarchical. They're all controlled by a single chief in charge. They have chains of command. They all engage in certain kinds of activities. So in some ways, they look very similar to each other. But in another way, a lot of policing is governed by local norms and local expectations. So some departments will heavily police property crime, and others consider this protecting human life their priority. Some are very permissive about First Amendment activity, even when it does things like it interferes with traffic, blocks local streets, and others crack down immediately on those who, for example, block passage. And those are all differences that are governed by local political processes and local culture, and they influence what policing looks like in real time. So I think, on one hand, very, very similar. On the other hand, very, very different.
So one of the things I know you've written about is what the federal government should do regarding local policing. And not only do you have opinions and expertise about that, but you were recently called on to share some of that expertise in a White House appointment as senior policy advisor on criminal justice issues. So I wonder if you can expand on what the federal government's role is in local policing, perhaps what it should be, and what the current administration has issued as part of their policing executive order.
If you think about the federal government, you go back to elementary school and you learn there are three branches of government. There's courts, there's Congress, and there's president and the executive branch. And if you think about what the federal government does or should do about local policing, I think you have to think in terms of courts, Congress, and the executive branch. I said earlier that in law school, we often think about the courts and the Constitution, and that is one thing that's very important. Courts regulate what the police do in the context of criminal cases where people challenge police activities, especially in trying to get evidence excluded. And they also encounter policing in terms of civil suits against the police and the immunities that police officers are sometimes eligible for in those suits. That's the court part of policing, and a lot is written about how and when that should be different than it is now. In the article that I recently wrote with a couple of other scholars, Farhang Hadari at Vanderbilt and Barry Friedman at NYU, we were thinking more about Congress and the executive branch and the role that they play in influencing local policing. And in terms of Congress, federal privacy law, federal civil rights law, those are all things that influence what police officers do, what they're permitted to do. And that's something, Congress has not been very active in this area in many years. It's just been something that they haven't been focused on, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't be focused on it, and they could be influencing policing much more than they do now. The major way that Congress influences policing now is by funding it. The federal grant programs offer a significant amount of money. The Justice Department gave away about $5 billion last year, maybe slightly less, to local policing. And that's just the Justice Department. If you add in Department of Homeland Security, other departments, even the Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services, offer grants and funding to local police departments. And so I should correct myself. The $5 billion didn't just go to local police departments. It went to public safety, which includes funding for victims and cities and other efforts like community violence intervention programs. But broadly, public safety is a huge locus of funding, including local policing. And that's the primary role that Congress has played, at least in recent years, in local policing. The executive branch has traditionally been, I think, thought of as the least powerful with respect to local policing. But as the courts and Congress have gotten less active, you see more significant efforts to influence policing through executive action. For one thing, the executive branch administers those grant programs that Congress funds, and they have a lot of room to do so. And so that's one way. And then there are things like what's probably the most significant federal effort to reform local policing ever, which is President Biden's executive order issued on the second anniversary of the death of George Floyd, on May 25th. The death was in 2020. The executive order was issued in 2022. And it radically set standards and for federal law enforcement officers, and then used some of the levers available to federal actors to influence local policing. One of those is through the grant programs, and another is through guidance and technical assistance that can help local policing adhere to some of the same standards that federal law enforcement officers are expected to adhere to.
So I moved across the country in the summer of 2020. And within a week of George Floyd's murder, I was sitting at my desk alone because much of the campus was home as a law school dean for the first time. And it was horrific. And students were up in arms, even though they weren't on campus. And all of a sudden, all these statements started to appear among my dean colleagues. And I was thinking, what can I say? What should I say? How do I say it? I'm really struggling with all of that. And we have certainly had some additional deaths as a result of police encounters since then, but that really seemed like the rallying cry. And I wonder if you can share, in addition to the executive order, how things have changed as a result of that horrific death of George Floyd in local policing, and what you see as continued changes that will come about because of that horrific death.
I think George Floyd really was an important historical moment in the history of policing. It isn't the first and won't be the last death that changes the public's perspective on what policing looks like and should look like. But boy, it was an important one. When I finished the first edition of The Law of the Police just months after George Floyd was killed, when I was spending a lot of my time answering questions and doing podcasts and educating journalists and others, activists about policing and the law. And I finished the book and thought that it might be out of date by the time it was published just a few months later, because it seemed like we were on the verge of a real transformation in policing. And in writing the second edition, I think what I realized is that less changed than many wished for and others feared. Policing structurally looks very much like it did before 2020. Police departments are structured the same way. Police have the same basic powers. So in many significant ways, policing is what it was before. But in other ways, I think it has actually changed significantly. States were very inactive regulators of the police, despite the fact that they empower police and despite the fact that they have the best opportunity to affect how policing operates in this country. States had been largely inactive. They started to pick up their activity in regulating local policing after the death of Michael Brown, something that is close to home for you if you're in St. Louis. So you saw a pickup in state laws around policing at that point, but that activity got much greater in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. And what you saw is real creativity and effort by states to try to make things different. So you saw states empowering civilian review and community oversight boards. You saw states regulating the use of force and limiting it, regulating police pursuits, regulating stops, regulating all sorts of aspects of policing, imposing a lot of training requirements on police, things that have had a big impact. And actually, the second edition of the casebook is regulating no-knock warrants and no-knock entries, for example. Those things are now, I think, playing a much bigger role in how police operate than they were years before, when people were really turning to the courts to influence what police did. So I think that has been a change. And I also think localities are rethinking the role of the police. And broadly, this isn't so much a legal change, right, although law has played a role in it, as looking for opportunities to reduce unnecessary police interactions and also bulk up the alternatives to policing and other ways of producing public safety. I think the wishes of abolitionists have not come true, and I think we're a long way from getting rid of the project, of course, of policing, because there will, in my mind, always likely to be times when the state wants people to do things that they don't want to do, and sometimes there have to be hands-on bodies to do that. Most people will not arrest themselves. It doesn't mean that we should have as many arrests as we have now. In fact, I wrote an article suggesting that we could have radically fewer, but I think that there will be some, and as a result, I think the project of policing is likely to continue, and most of the public thinks it should. But that doesn't mean that the project is going to look like it does now, and I think what you see in localities is creative efforts to try to civilianize activities that don't need the kinds of state coercion that people have been subjected to, and also creative ways to replace policing with technology, and then to regulate the police in the contexts in which they have left. So I think a lot of this work is now being done at the state and local level. I think there's a lot of creativity and innovation, and we're still seeing how those experiments are playing out, but I think they're very exciting.
I agree with you. There are some very exciting initiatives. Of course, the therapeutic courts are playing a big role in what happens with those who are involved with police and the criminal justice system. But then having social workers and mental health workers working alongside some of the 911 calls, that's very exciting. Where do you see things going, and how do local police respond to the efforts of some localities these days to not intervene, maybe in some low-level drug offenses that you're seeing, but also, as you talked about, the property crimes that you see some localities choosing not to arrest people for now? How do you see that evolving over time?
I think there have always been a range of practices in terms of enforcing low-level law. No police officer and no police department in the country enforces the law fully. The law is not written as if it could be enforced fully, and no department tries to do it. So police officers turning a blind eye is the wrong way to think about it. A more helpful way might be that police officers use the law as a resource to solve problems they think are worth solving. And what they think is worth solving is something that's governed in large part by departments and by communities. And so I think one of the problems we've long had in policing is that people were unequal in their ability to influence what problems were treated as worth solving. And some people were treated as if they were problems worth solving, as opposed to people who had needs and could be handled in all sorts of more empathetic ways. And that's not just true of people who with substance use disorders and people struggling with mental health issues, but also, and homelessness, but also people who appear different, or people who are engaged in First Amendment activities, or people who are gender nonconforming have sometimes been treated by communities as problems worth solving, and then the police have leveraged the law to quote unquote solve those problems. I think that what we've always had a range of practices, and now you see communities more self-consciously deciding that some problems shouldn't be solved at the point of a gun, or really in practice with the threat of handcuffs. And so as we do that, that introduces a lot of questions about how we do address those problems, and also what problems we still think are ones that might require the law and police officers involved. And I think we're going to see some adjustment over time as communities experiment and see what works. And that's a good thing, not I don't think that's a failure of the experiment. I think that's an experiment that's going to have to keep playing out. And I think police departments are important, and police officers and police leadership are important participants in those experiments and have a lot of thoughts about what could be done differently, in addition to the communities that are heavily policed and not always heard in the political process.
So I like your framing of that, problems worth solving in communities, and all the stakeholders being part of that conversation for how best to solve those problems. Do we give our police enough funding and training at the local level to have those informed discernment in making those decisions out in the field?
I think it depends who you ask. I don't know that it's a matter of how much training or how much funding, but what that training looks like and how the funds are used. So I think it's hard to say that police get too much or too little money. That's not always, I think, the relevant question, but whether communities are engaged in the project of producing public safety in a variety of ways, including policing, in ways that are likely to earn the public's trust and also solve those problems. The biggest crises in policing today are not really a lack of funds, but recruitment and retention issues, which sometimes is tied to funding and underpay, but also is tied to lots of other things, and officer wellness. I think those are the two greatest challenges for police departments today. And I think we need to spend a lot of time thinking about those challenges, because even those people who are skeptical about the role of policing in communities have to understand that when we have policing, officer wellness also affects community wellness, and recruitment and retention problems affect how police officers are used. So, for example, if you have many communities are unable to fill the spots they have for police officers. And that means police officers are sent out alone when they should have backup, for example. And that means that a police officer is more at risk, and a police officer who is more at risk is more likely, or more afraid, is more likely to use force. And so I think we have to treat the issues for policing and police officers as also as community issues that affect community well-being. And those are the two that really strike me. So more of training. Training is the one thing that almost everybody can agree on, more training, although there's certainly been some pushback on that since 2020 because of the costs, the funding that training takes up that might be used for other things. But I think it's also about what kind of training, about research about what works in training to actually influence policing, and understanding the other factors that contribute to how police behave: supervision, disciplinary structures, incentives, and the like, and officer wellness.
Well, these are fascinating issues, not just related to police, obviously, but as you've noted so importantly, just the public safety of our communities and the wellness of our communities, in addition to those who are enforcing the laws. Thank you so much for sharing what you have covered or some of it in the Law of the Police second edition book with Aspen Publishing. I know that we could talk for a long time about what else you've covered in that book. And I guess my last question related to the book would be, do you have any recommendations for someone who's thinking about offering such a course and is just getting started? Any suggestion for how to approach offering such a course?
Well, I will say the book is intended to be quite flexible. So some people teach seminars from the book on the use of force, or seminars on police misconduct, seminars on remedies and reforms for policing. Other people teach 3-credit traditional law courses from the book. And that's something I do. I teach actually 2 courses, Law of the Police 1 and Law of the Police 2. And one is Rights and Regulations, and the other is Remedies and Reforms. And then some people have challenged my thinking about this and treated the book as a criminal procedure book and taught police-focused versions of criminal procedure, which was not what I originally intended, but actually seems to be working pretty well for some professors. I am always happy to be a resource for a professor who's thinking about teaching in these areas. I think there are now more resources. This is the only casebook, but I think supplementing it, I supplement my courses with lots of recent events and documents and indictments and other policing executive order, all sorts of things that help me bring this both current. And you asked why I made a second edition so quickly. And one of the reasons is because I want the book to be filled with current law. And I think there are a lot of opportunities to integrate current events into these courses.
Well, thank you. Before we conclude, I want to ask you to think more broadly about legal education and make a prediction as to what you think will change about legal education in the coming decade, if anything.
Well, I think there are all sorts of big forces that are operating on legal education, and I won't speak to the role of AI or whether we should have 2 years or 3 years or any of those issues. But what I can say from my perspective is that traditional law courses were separated out like legal boxes that we put issues in the world into. So somebody walks into a lawyer's office and says, I was hurt by a police officer when he arrested me. What can I do about it? And we teach a course called civil rights litigation because that's one of the boxes that you can stick that event in the world into. And that if someone goes back an agreement, we put it in the contracts box. And if someone injures you in an accident, it's in the torts box. And the way that the law school looks like is that we teach the boxes. But I think, one of the things I'm trying to do here is say, look, there are events in the world, and we can focus on those events and teach the law that governs them rather than focus on the boxes that are going to get them into court. I actually think that's likely to be a broader force in legal education. I think we are going to focus much more on the kinds of problems in the world that lawyers are addressing and prepare them to address those problems, and less about the traditional boxes, even though we need to understand those boxes in thinking about how to handle those problems.
Well, that's an exciting prediction, and I hope that it comes to fruition. I want to thank you for sharing with us some of your work in the law of policing and, of course, information about your book, The Law of the Police, second edition from Aspen Publishing. Also want to congratulate you on wrapping up your senior policy advisory position with the White House on criminal justice issues. I know you're back on campus now, and I know your students will be excited to have you back at the University of Virginia teaching them this fall. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear additional interviews with thought leaders in the Legal Academy, please check out Aspen Leading Edge's podcast webpage or your other channels for your favorite podcasts. Thank you.